In the heart of Havana, a mysterious attack leaves American diplomats with debilitating injuries, and the world is left in the dark. Was it a sonic weapon, a covert Russian assault, or something even more sinister? As victims' lives are shattered and governments remain silent, the truth behind Havana Syndrome threatens to unravel the very fabric of international diplomacy. The hunt for answers begins, but will anyone dare confront the shadowy force responsible? Chapter 1. The first incident: strange sounds in Havana. In late 2016, diplomats stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Havana, Cuba, began experiencing a bizarre series of symptoms that would come to mystify the international community. What started as occasional complaints of dizziness, headaches, and ear pain among embassy staff soon escalated into a full-blown medical and diplomatic crisis. The strange experiences left those affected bewildered and set the stage for what would later be referred to as the Havana Syndrome. The first individual to report symptoms was a CIA officer stationed under diplomatic cover. In August 2016, after returning home from a walk around his neighborhood, he began to experience an intense headache and a sense of pressure inside his head. According to his testimony, he had heard an unusual sound, akin to a loud buzzing or high-pitched ringing, shortly before the symptoms began. At first, he brushed it off as fatigue, perhaps from the humid Cuban summer, but the symptoms persisted. Over the following days, dizziness set in, and he experienced intermittent bouts of nausea and confusion. Concerned, he sought medical attention but received little in the way of concrete answers. Within weeks, similar stories began to surface from other embassy personnel. One of the more notable cases involved a senior diplomat who described hearing an eerie, pulsing noise while lying in bed at night. The noise seemed to come from one side of his room, and when he moved, the sound appeared to follow him. This auditory phenomenon was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The sound was accompanied by a sensation of pressure in his ears, followed by intense headaches and a general feeling of disorientation. It felt as though something was targeting him, but there was no clear source. At first, doctors were baffled, dismissing it as a stress-related illness. But as more and more staff reported similar symptoms, the theory of mass psychogenic illness, the idea that these symptoms were the result of psychological stress, began to seem insufficient. By early 2017, over a dozen embassy workers had reported unusual health issues. The embassy's health office began documenting the cases, and officials realized that many of the affected individuals described hearing a strange, high-pitched sound or feeling an inexplicable pressure before their symptoms began. The commonalities among the accounts were alarming: a sudden onset of dizziness, headaches, tinnitus, and in some cases, temporary hearing loss. Those affected also reported cognitive issues, such as memory lapses and difficulty concentrating. One U.S. Foreign Service officer recalled an incident where she was standing in her kitchen when, out of nowhere, she heard what she described as an intense, localized sound that caused her to feel as though her brain was vibrating. The sensation was so disorienting that she had to sit down to regain her balance. Her husband, who was in the next room, heard nothing. This eerie experience would be echoed by others, all of whom described the sounds as inexplicable and highly localized, often only affecting one person at a time in shared spaces. Despite the surreal nature of these incidents, they were now happening with disturbing frequency. By February 2017, the growing number of cases forced the U.S. government to act. Officials at the State Department became aware that something strange was happening in Havana, though they struggled to determine exactly what it was. Some initially suspected a sonic attack, while others thought it might be an environmental factor, such as exposure to toxins. However, environmental assessments of the embassy compound and the homes of the affected diplomats found no evidence of harmful agents. As the mystery deepened, diplomats were encouraged to report any unusual symptoms. Several additional cases surfaced, and Canadian diplomats began to report similar health problems, suggesting that this was not an isolated issue. A notable moment of panic occurred when a group of embassy workers gathered for a briefing on the emerging health crisis. According to one attendee, the mood in the room was tense. As more people came forward with their experiences, fear spread among the staff. One individual described a palpable sense of paranoia setting in as colleagues began questioning whether they were being targeted deliberately. Some wondered if the Cuban government, or a foreign power operating in Cuba, could be behind these strange occurrences. By the summer of 2017, the situation had become untenable. In total, 21 U.S. Embassy staff members, as well as several Canadian diplomats and their families, reported experiencing symptoms. As cases continued to rise, embassy personnel were quietly evacuated from Havana, and Washington began its own investigation. The State Department issued a warning to all U.S. diplomats stationed in Cuba, advising them to leave the country if they experienced any unusual symptoms. The U.S. reduced its diplomatic presence in Havana to a skeleton staff, and new arrivals were briefed on the potential risks. The Cuban government, caught off guard by the accusations, vehemently denied any involvement. Cuban officials cooperated with American investigators, allowing them to inspect embassy facilities and even meeting with U.S. doctors in an attempt to resolve the situation. Nevertheless, relations between the two countries, which had been slowly improving after decades of Cold War hostility, soured. The U.S. government accused Cuba of either directly orchestrating the attacks or failing to protect American diplomats from a third party. Meanwhile, the affected individuals underwent a battery of tests in the U.S. to determine the cause of their symptoms. The results were troubling. Many exhibited signs of what medical professionals term traumatic brain injury, typically associated with exposure to explosions or severe physical impacts. However, in this case, no such events had occurred. Neurological exams showed that some victims had sustained lasting damage to their brain tissue, leading to cognitive impairment and, in extreme cases, long-term disability. Yet no one could explain how or why this had happened. As the weeks passed and more embassy staff were diagnosed, a chilling realization began to sink in. Havana Syndrome wasn't just an isolated incident. It was the beginning of something much larger, something that would challenge medical professionals and intelligence agencies alike, and sow doubt within the highest levels of government. The mystery of what exactly had happened in Havana would soon spread far beyond Cuba's shores, leaving in its wake a trail of fear, uncertainty, and international intrigue. Chapter 2. The Cover-Up or Confusion. Initial responses from Washington. As the mysterious afflictions affecting U.S. and Canadian diplomats in Havana grew more frequent in early 2017, confusion gripped Washington. The strange symptoms, headaches, dizziness, cognitive impairment, were unlike anything the State Department or intelligence community had ever encountered. At first, many officials in Washington were skeptical. The idea of a sonic or directed energy weapon causing such harm sounded more like the plot of a science fiction novel than a real diplomatic crisis. The earliest reports trickling into the U.S. government from Cuba were vague. In August 2016, when the first embassy personnel came forward with their symptoms, it was not immediately clear that something serious was happening. The U.S. Embassy in Havana was still new, having reopened in 2015 after a thaw in relations between the United States and Cuba. There was a sense of optimism in Washington and Havana as diplomatic ties were being rebuilt after decades of Cold War-era hostility. The Obama administration had prioritized these efforts, so when diplomats began falling ill, some officials were reluctant to believe it could be part of a larger, more sinister plot. Initially, some within the government suspected the symptoms were psychosomatic, a product of the stress many diplomats felt working in a high-pressure environment. This theory, known as mass psychogenic illness, suggested that the symptoms could be contagious in a psychological sense, especially in tightly knit communities like embassy staff. However, as more and more cases were reported, skepticism within the government began to give way to alarm. By February 2017, over a dozen embassy personnel had reported symptoms, and the State Department could no longer dismiss the pattern as mere coincidence. The U.S. government faced a dilemma. Relations with Cuba were fragile, and officials were wary of escalating tensions without clear evidence. Internally, the situation became increasingly tense. Declassified documents later revealed that early internal reports were conflicted, with some in the intelligence community pushing to take immediate action, while others urged caution. The fear was that accusing Cuba or another foreign actor of attacking U.S. diplomats could not only derail the hard-won diplomatic progress, but potentially ignite a broader international incident. In March 2017, the U.S. government sent a team of medical experts to Havana to assess the situation. Their findings were troubling. Many of the affected diplomats exhibited signs of traumatic brain injury, despite having no history of head trauma. Neurological exams revealed abnormal brain scans, and some victims had trouble with memory and concentration. The symptoms were real and serious, but their cause remained a mystery. This only deepened the confusion in Washington. At the same time, there were growing suspicions within the intelligence community that the incidents were the result of a deliberate attack. Some speculated that the Cuban government was involved, either directly or through complicity with a third party. Others pointed to Russia, which had a long history of using unconventional means to harass U.S. personnel abroad. Theories swirled, and tensions within the government rose as officials debated how to respond. Behind closed doors, secret memos circulated warning U.S. embassy staff of the possibility of a sonic weapon. This theory, which would dominate the public discourse for months, suggested that a new type of acoustic device might be responsible for the attacks. Diplomatic cables from Havana described the strange noises many victims heard just before their symptoms began. High-pitched buzzing, low-frequency humming, and in some cases, a sensation of pressure inside their heads. These descriptions seemed to support the idea of some kind of sonic device. However, acoustic experts within the government were skeptical, noting that no known sound waves could cause the type of brain damage seen in the affected diplomats. Still, the sonic weapon theory gained traction, particularly within the media. By mid-2017, news outlets were reporting on the mysterious attacks in Havana, and the term sonic weapon became a common refrain. This added to the growing fear among embassy staff, not just in Cuba, but in other parts of the world. In fact, the paranoia spread quickly to U.S. embassies in places like China and Russia, where diplomats began to report similar symptoms. The fear that other embassies could be targeted raised the stakes dramatically. In Washington, as the number of reported cases continued to rise, officials faced mounting pressure to respond. Members of Congress demanded answers, while victims and their families pushed for more aggressive action. Yet, the U.S. government hesitated. Declassified emails show that officials were concerned about the potential fallout of accusing a foreign government, especially Cuba, without definitive proof. The last thing Washington wanted was to provoke an international incident, especially as tensions with Russia and North Korea were already simmering on the global stage. Internally, there was also fear that revealing too much about the incidents could tip off the perpetrators, whoever they were, and make it harder to investigate. The FBI was called in to investigate the incidents in Havana, but their findings were inconclusive. Meanwhile, the CIA conducted its own covert investigation, but with little success. The secrecy surrounding the investigations fueled speculation and suspicion, both within the government and in the public. By the summer of 2017, the situation had reached a boiling point. The State Department made the decision to evacuate all non-essential personnel from the Havana embassy, citing health concerns. This marked the beginning of a sharp decline in U.S.-Cuban relations. Cuba's government, blindsided by the accusations, vehemently denied any involvement and offered to cooperate with U.S. investigators. Cuban officials even invited the FBI to inspect embassy buildings and interview Cuban intelligence officers, hoping to clear their country's name. But trust between the two nations had already begun to erode. As the summer wore on, more and more embassy personnel in other countries began reporting symptoms similar to those seen in Havana. This raised new questions. Could these incidents be part of a coordinated global campaign? If so, who was behind it, and what was their goal? The U.S. government, caught between the need for secrecy and the growing public outcry, struggled to find a coherent response. The lack of definitive answers only added to the sense of confusion. Publicly, officials continued to stress that they were investigating all possible explanations. But internally, there was a growing sense that they were no closer to understanding the cause than they had been at the beginning. As the number of cases grew, the government's inability to provide clear answers sparked frustration and fear within the diplomatic community. For those affected, the mystery of Havana Syndrome was not just a diplomatic puzzle, it was a personal nightmare with no end in sight. Chapter 3: A Growing Mystery, the Syndrome Spreads. By mid-2017, the strange symptoms that first surfaced in Havana had spread to other corners of the globe, baffling both the U.S. government and medical experts. What had begun as an isolated crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Cuba quickly expanded into a global phenomenon. American diplomats, CIA officers, and their families stationed in places as far-flung as China, Russia, and even Europe began reporting similar experiences: sudden headaches, dizziness, and cognitive difficulties that often left them debilitated. The rising number of cases sparked fear and confusion within the diplomatic community, and a sense of paranoia began to take hold. In May 2018, the U.S. consulate in Guangzhou, China, reported the first incident outside of Cuba. A Foreign Service officer, who had previously served in Havana, described experiencing symptoms eerily similar to those that had afflicted her colleagues in Cuba. She recalled hearing strange, high-pitched sounds in her apartment, followed by a sensation of pressure in her head and an immediate onset of dizziness. "It was like something was drilling into my skull," she later told investigators. Within days, other consulate staff in Guangzhou came forward with similar complaints. The case was troubling not only because of its similarity to the Havana incidents, but because it suggested that whatever had happened in Cuba was now happening elsewhere. The State Department quickly evacuated the affected individuals and sent them to the University of Pennsylvania for medical evaluation, just as they had done with the victims from Havana. The tests yielded the same perplexing results: brain injuries akin to concussions, without any external trauma. The findings deepened the mystery, and the possibility of a deliberate attack became harder to dismiss. As one U.S. official put it in a classified memo, "We are facing something new and unprecedented, something that we cannot yet explain." Across the world, the number of cases continued to rise. In Russia, several CIA officers began to report similar symptoms, though their cases were initially kept secret due to the sensitive nature of their work. One officer stationed in Moscow described feeling an intense pressure in his head while inside his hotel room, followed by nausea and confusion. He later recounted that the sensation was unlike anything he had experienced before. "It was as if someone flipped a switch in my brain," he said. This officer had been involved in covert operations, leading some to speculate that he might have been specifically targeted. Yet the idea of a foreign power using some kind of advanced weapon to incapacitate U.S. personnel still seemed too outlandish for many in the intelligence community to accept. As more incidents were reported from places like Uzbekistan and even parts of Europe, the U.S. government was forced to reconsider the scope of the problem. Was this part of a broader campaign of harassment against U.S. diplomats and intelligence officers? Or were these isolated incidents coincidentally mirroring each other? The lack of concrete evidence left officials divided. Some believe that the growing number of cases pointed to a deliberate act of espionage, potentially involving a foreign power like Russia, while others remained skeptical, clinging to the possibility that this was a case of mass hysteria. Real testimony from diplomats and their families underscored the growing sense of paranoia within the international community. In one particularly chilling account, a U.S. diplomat stationed in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, described how his young son fell ill with symptoms similar to those seen in Havana. The child began complaining of headaches and difficulty sleeping, and soon after, the diplomat himself started experiencing dizziness and confusion. The diplomat recalled how the incident left him feeling helpless and terrified, not just for his own health, but for his family's safety. "We didn't know who or what was behind this, but it felt like we were being hunted," he said. His testimony was just one of many that painted a picture of fear spreading through the diplomatic corps. In Washington, the intelligence community was scrambling to understand what was happening. The CIA formed a task force to investigate the incidents, but progress was slow. Covert medical teams were dispatched to assess the victims and try to determine a cause, but they faced skepticism from some quarters of the intelligence community, where doubts lingered about the validity of the reports. Internal emails later revealed that some senior officials believed the symptoms were being exaggerated or, worse, fabricated. One particularly dismissive message referred to the situation as hysteria spreading among overly stressed diplomats. Yet, the medical evidence told a different story. Doctors at the University of Pennsylvania, who were treating the victims, found consistent signs of brain injury among many of the affected individuals. These injuries were similar to those caused by exposure to blasts or concussive forces, but none of the victims had experienced anything like that. The mystery deepened as researchers began to explore the possibility of directed energy weapons, devices that could, in theory, deliver invisible waves of energy capable of disrupting brain function. Though speculative, this theory gained traction within certain circles of the intelligence community, especially as the cases continued to multiply. Meanwhile, suspicion grew that these incidents might be linked to covert operations. Some diplomats and CIA officers believed they were being targeted because of their sensitive work, particularly in countries like Russia and China, where U.S. intelligence efforts were under constant scrutiny. Rumors swirled about sophisticated surveillance techniques and experimental weaponry being used by foreign powers. A former CIA officer, speaking on condition of anonymity, recalled how his team began to alter their behavior in response to the threat. "We were constantly looking over our shoulders, checking for anything out of the ordinary," he said. "We didn't know what we were dealing with, but we knew it was real." The growing paranoia wasn't confined to just the diplomats and intelligence officers in the field. Back in Washington, top officials were becoming increasingly concerned that the U.S. was under attack by an unseen adversary. Some began to speculate that Russia might be behind the incidents, using some form of clandestine technology to target U.S. personnel. A classified intelligence assessment from 2018, later leaked to the media, raised the possibility that Russian operatives could be using microwave radiation or another form of directed energy to incapacitate U.S. diplomats. The report noted that Russia had a history of using unconventional means to harass U.S. personnel, including previous instances of irradiating U.S. embassy buildings in Moscow during the Cold War. As the mystery of Havana Syndrome spread across the globe, it became clear that this was no longer just a localized problem in Cuba. The phenomenon was now a worldwide concern, and the U.S. government was struggling to keep up. Victims continued to experience debilitating symptoms, and the fear of who might be next cast a long shadow over U.S. diplomatic and intelligence circles. While medical teams worked around the clock to understand the syndrome, one question loomed larger than all the others. Who was behind it, and what did they want? Chapter 4: Science Under Pressure, Medical Investigations. As the number of mysterious cases mounted, the U.S. government was forced to confront an alarming truth. Its diplomats were suffering from something real and devastating, but no one could explain what it was. The symptoms were eerily consistent across continents: headaches, dizziness, cognitive impairment, and in some cases debilitating memory loss. But the cause of these ailments remained shrouded in mystery. To unravel this enigma, the State Department and intelligence agencies turned to the medical community for answers. What followed was a series of unprecedented medical investigations that only deepened the puzzle. The first group of victims, U.S. diplomats stationed in Havana, were sent to the University of Pennsylvania Center for Brain Injury and Repair in 2017. The team there had experience treating traumatic brain injuries, but this was unlike anything they had seen before. The victims described a sudden onset of symptoms that often began with hearing strange, high-pitched sounds or feeling a pressure in their skulls. Some had trouble standing, others couldn't concentrate, and a few even developed chronic insomnia. Despite these alarming symptoms, there were no visible signs of physical trauma. There had been no explosions, no impacts, nothing to suggest a traditional head injury. Dr. Douglas H. Smith, the lead neurologist overseeing the cases, was baffled. Initial brain scans revealed subtle but significant abnormalities. "We were seeing patterns of brain injury that looked like concussion or mild traumatic brain injury," Dr. Smith later explained. But these individuals had not suffered any blows to the head. Many of the affected diplomats had visible damage to the white matter in their brains, which suggested a disruption in neural pathways, similar to what doctors might see in patients who had been in a car accident or exposed to a blast wave. Yet, there had been no physical incident to explain such injuries. The findings were perplexing and alarming. One patient, a mid-level diplomat who wished to remain anonymous, recounted his experience undergoing the tests. "It was surreal," he said. "One day, I'm a healthy, functioning adult, and the next, I can't even remember basic things. I couldn't hold a conversation without feeling like my head was going to explode. The doctors were just as confused as I was. They knew something was wrong, but they couldn't tell me why." The medical community found itself in uncharted territory. Theories swirled, each more outlandish than the last. Could this be a new kind of virus? A psychological phenomenon? Or, as some began to suspect, could these symptoms be the result of a targeted attack using an unknown weapon? The latter theory gained traction as the cases spread beyond Cuba to other U.S. diplomatic outposts in China, Russia, and beyond. Victims were reporting nearly identical symptoms, often preceded by hearing strange noises or feeling an intense pressure in their heads. At the University of Miami, where some of the Havana victims were also treated, Dr. Michael Hoffer, an ear, nose, and throat specialist, conducted his own studies. His team examined patients who had complained of hearing loss and balance issues. Using advanced auditory tests and neuroimaging, they found that many of the diplomats had suffered damage to their inner ears, specifically to the cochlea, which could explain their dizziness and hearing problems. However, this still didn't explain the brain injuries. "It's like they were hit by a wave of energy," Dr. Hoffer said, "but no one can figure out where that wave came from." The possibility of an energy weapon began to gain serious consideration. Some researchers speculated that a form of directed energy, possibly microwave radiation, could be responsible. This theory wasn't new. In fact, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had used microwave radiation to bombard the U.S. Embassy in Moscow for years. However, the idea that such technology could cause traumatic brain injuries without leaving external burns or other signs was unprecedented. To test this theory, scientists at the National Institutes of Health and the Defense Department began conducting secretive studies, but their results were inconclusive. One of the more startling pieces of evidence came from Dr. Beatrice Gollum, a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Gollum had researched the effects of electromagnetic radiation on human health for years, and she believed that the symptoms reported by the Havana victims were consistent with exposure to microwave energy. In a published report, she noted that the specific combination of auditory phenomena, cognitive issues, and brain damage matched what scientists knew about the biological effects of microwaves. "It's not definitive," she said, "but it's one of the most plausible explanations we have at this point." However, the idea of a directed energy weapon raised more questions than it answered. If such a weapon existed, who was behind it? How was it being deployed? And why were only U.S. diplomats being targeted? The secrecy surrounding the medical investigations only added to the growing sense of conspiracy. In fact, many of the studies conducted on the victims were classified, and the results were shared with only a small circle of government officials. Some doctors who worked on the cases were frustrated by the lack of transparency. "We were doing our best to help these people," one researcher said, "but there was a lot we weren't being told." As the medical teams continued their investigations, victims grew increasingly desperate for answers. Real case studies like that of Mark Lindsay, a security engineer at the U.S. consulate in Guangzhou, painted a chilling picture. Lindsay, his wife, and their children all began experiencing symptoms in 2018, shortly after the first reports of Havana Syndrome in China. Lindsay described a sudden, overwhelming sensation of pressure in his head, followed by extreme fatigue and cognitive decline. His young son complained of hearing a weird sound in the family's apartment, and Lindsay's wife developed migraines that left her bedridden for days. "It felt like we were under attack, but no one could see the weapon," Lindsay said. The lack of answers weighed heavily on the victims and their families. Some felt that the U.S. government wasn't doing enough to protect them or provide the necessary medical care. Others feared that the true extent of the syndrome was being covered up for political reasons. As more diplomats fell ill, the medical teams working on the case were racing against time to identify the cause. But for every clue they uncovered, a dozen more questions emerged. One diplomat, still recovering from the symptoms he had developed in Havana, expressed the frustration felt by many. "It's like living in a nightmare," he said. "We know something is happening to us, something real, but no one can tell us what it is or how to stop it. Every day, we wonder, will we ever get the answers we need? The medical investigations, though rigorous and thorough, ultimately provided more mystery than resolution. With every new study came the chilling realization that this was a phenomenon unlike anything seen before, a growing puzzle with no clear solution in sight. Chapter 5: Theories and Shadow Players. Who's behind it? As the strange cases of Havana Syndrome spread from Cuba to China, Russia, and beyond, a growing number of intelligence experts, scientists, and politicians began to ask the same question. Who is behind this? The symptoms were too specific, the victims too targeted, to believe it was mere coincidence. Theories began to circulate, and one name kept coming up: Russia, as evidence slowly accumulated. Many in the intelligence community became convinced that Russia, using some form of microwave or directed energy weapon, was conducting covert attacks against American diplomats with chilling precision. The theory that Russia was behind the attacks didn't emerge in a vacuum. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had used similar techniques to harass the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, bombarding it with low-level microwave radiation in an operation known as the Moscow Signal. For years, U.S. Embassy staff reported a range of health issues, from headaches to cancers, all without an apparent cause. While no definitive link was ever made between the microwave radiation and the health problems, the Moscow Signal became a historical touchpoint as officials sought to explain the modern-day Havana Syndrome cases. By 2018, the theory that Russia was behind the attacks had gained traction within certain circles of the U.S. government. Intelligence officials began compiling evidence, some of it circumstantial, some of it based on classified intercepts that pointed to Russian operatives as the likely perpetrators. One former CIA officer, speaking on condition of anonymity, recalled a meeting where senior intelligence officials laid out the theory. They showed us satellite images and signal intelligence that seemed to suggest that Russian operatives were in close proximity to many of the locations where these incidents occurred, the officer said. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to make us seriously consider the possibility. Some in the intelligence community believe that Russia was using a form of microwave weapon, possibly a new and advanced iteration of older Cold War technology, to incapacitate U.S. diplomats and intelligence officers. These weapons, the theory went, could emit bursts of concentrated energy that would disrupt brain function, causing symptoms like dizziness, headaches, and cognitive impairment. The directed energy theory was supported by several prominent scientists, including Dr. Beatrice Golem, a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Diego, who had studied the biological effects of electromagnetic radiation. In interviews, Dr. Golem explained that the symptoms reported by Havana Syndrome victims were consistent with what one might expect from exposure to directed microwave energy. However, despite the growing body of evidence, the U.S. government remained cautious about directly accusing Russia. Diplomatic relations between the two countries were already tense, and many in Washington feared that an open confrontation over Havana Syndrome could escalate into a full-blown crisis. One high-ranking State Department official, who was involved in early discussions about the syndrome, recalled the internal debates. There were some in the administration who wanted to come out hard against Russia, but others were much more cautious. The fear was that if we accused them without hard proof, we could provoke a response we weren't prepared to handle, the official said. The reluctance to confront Russia directly led to frustration within parts of the intelligence community. Some CIA officers, particularly those who had been personally affected by the syndrome, felt that the U.S. was being too passive. One CIA officer who had been stationed in Moscow when he developed symptoms described the situation as infuriating. We knew something was happening. We knew it wasn't random. But every time we pushed for answers or for action, we were told to stand down, he said. There was a real fear of making this into an international incident. Behind the scenes, classified meetings were held at the highest levels of government to discuss the possibility of retaliation. Some officials advocated for covert countermeasures, believing that a show of strength might deter further attacks. But others cautioned that without concrete proof, any retaliatory action could backfire. It was a real dilemma, one former national security advisor said. On the one hand, we couldn't just sit by and do nothing while our people were being targeted. But on the other hand, We didn't want to risk escalating tensions with Russia, especially when the broader geopolitical situation was already so fragile. The debate over how to respond wasn't confined to Washington. Allies of the United States, particularly Canada and the United Kingdom, were also grappling with the growing evidence that their diplomats might be at risk. Canadian diplomats stationed in Havana had reported similar symptoms, and British intelligence officials were quietly investigating several suspicious cases involving their own personnel. The international dimension of the problem made the situation even more complex. Any public accusation against Russia could have global repercussions, potentially driving a wedge between the U.S. and its allies. As tensions mounted, so did the secrecy surrounding the investigation. Internal memos and classified reports began to circulate within the intelligence community, many of which hinted at a larger, more organized campaign of harassment against Western diplomats. One particularly chilling report, which was later leaked to the media, described the possibility that Russia was using Havana Syndrome as a form of psychological warfare. This is a new kind of attack, the report read, one that is designed not just to incapacitate individuals, but to sow confusion, fear, and mistrust within the diplomatic community. In the meantime, the victims of Havana Syndrome remained caught in a geopolitical tug-of-war. Many of them continued to suffer from debilitating symptoms. Some had to leave their posts, unable to continue working, while others struggled to get proper medical treatment. The lack of clarity surrounding the cause of their illnesses only compounded their frustration. "It feels like we've been abandoned," said one former diplomat. "We're being attacked, but nobody seems willing to do anything about it." Chapter 6, a look at possible weapons, the technology behind the syndrome. As the mystery of Havana Syndrome deepened, attention turned to what kind of weapon could cause the strange array of symptoms experienced by U.S. diplomats and intelligence officers. Theories emerged about the type of technology that could be responsible, with many experts pointing to directed energy weapons, particularly microwave technology. This chapter delves into the science behind such weapons, looking at real, documented programs from various countries, including the US, Russia, and China. These secret weapons programs, often cloaked in deep government secrecy, have fueled speculation that Havana Syndrome may be the result of a new, advanced form of warfare. One of the most prominent theories regarding the weapon used in Havana Syndrome revolves around microwave radiation. This theory gained traction after a National Academies of Sciences report, commissioned by the U.S. State Department, concluded in 2020 that directed pulsed radio frequency energy, commonly referred to as microwaves, was the most likely cause of the victim's symptoms. The report suggested that this kind of energy could disrupt brain function, causing the mysterious symptoms experienced by U.S. personnel in Havana and elsewhere. Microwave technology has been experimented with for decades, dating back to the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union conducted research into the potential use of microwaves as weapons. The Moscow signal, as it was called, was one of the first documented uses of microwave energy against U.S. personnel. Between the 1950s and 1970s, U.S. diplomats in Moscow were exposed to microwave radiation directed at the U.S. Embassy, causing a range of health problems. Although the true purpose of the Moscow signal remains unclear, many believe it was an early attempt by the Soviets to test the effects of microwave radiation on the human body. In the years following the Cold War, research into directed energy weapons continued, particularly in the U.S. and Russia. These weapons, which use focused energy to cause damage, were seen as a promising frontier in military technology. The idea behind these weapons is that they can target individuals or equipment without the need for conventional ammunition or explosives. For example, directed energy weapons could disable electronics, damage infrastructure, or incapacitate people without leaving any physical trace. The U.S. military has been open about some of its research into directed energy weapons, particularly in the context of non-lethal crowd control. The U.S. Air Force, for instance, has developed a weapon known as the active denial system. This device uses millimeter wave technology to create a sensation of intense heat on the skin, forcing people to move away from the targeted area. While the ADS is intended for crowd control, its development shows that the U.S. has been actively researching and deploying directed energy weapons. However, the symptoms caused by the ADS are limited to discomfort and pain, and there is no evidence that it could cause the neurological damage seen in Havana Syndrome victims. Another potential type of weapon that could be responsible for Havana Syndrome is ultrasound technology. Some early theories suggested that the high-pitched sounds reported by victims could have been the result of an ultrasonic device. Ultrasound waves, which are typically used in medical imaging, can be focused and directed, potentially causing harm if misused. In 2018, two scientists from the University of Michigan proposed that the symptoms of Havana Syndrome could have been caused by intersecting ultrasonic beams. According to their theory, two or more ultrasonic beams, when aimed at the same location, could create a phenomenon known as intermodulation distortion, producing audible sounds and harmful effects on the brain. However, many experts have dismissed the ultrasound theory due to the physical limitations of the technology. Ultrasound requires close proximity to its target, making it an unlikely candidate for a covert weapon capable of targeting people over long distances. Furthermore, there is little evidence that ultrasound can cause the type of traumatic brain injuries seen in some victims of Havana Syndrome. The microwave theory, on the other hand, is supported by a growing body of scientific evidence. In recent years, researchers have conducted studies showing that microwave radiation can affect the brain in ways that align with the symptoms reported by Havana Syndrome victims. For instance, microwave auditory effects, also known as the Fry effect, occur when pulses of microwave radiation are absorbed by the head, causing people to hear sounds that aren't really there. These sounds, often described as clicking or buzzing, are caused by the rapid expansion of brain tissue as it heats up in response to the microwave energy. This could explain the strange noises heard by victims in Havana. Furthermore, studies on pulsed electromagnetic fields have shown that these fields can affect neural activity and potentially disrupt cognitive functions. PMF technology has been used in medical devices for years, but the possibility of weaponizing it raises serious concerns. If a device could generate focused pulses of electromagnetic energy, it could theoretically interfere with brain function, leading to symptoms like dizziness, confusion, and memory loss. Beyond microwaves and ultrasound, some have speculated about even more exotic weapons, such as neuroweapons designed to manipulate or disrupt brain activity. These weapons, still largely in the realm of science fiction, could potentially alter a person's thoughts or behaviors using electromagnetic fields or other forms of directed energy. While there is little concrete evidence that such technology currently exists, the rapid pace of military research into brain-machine interfaces and neurostimulation suggests that it may not be far off. Russia, in particular, has been at the forefront of research into directed energy weapons. In recent years, there have been reports that the Russian military is developing microwave-based weapons capable of disabling drones, aircraft, and even satellites. In 2018, Russian state media unveiled a weapon called the Peresvet, a laser system designed to target and disable enemy equipment. While these weapons are primarily focused on disabling technology, they demonstrate Russia's continued interest in directed energy research. China, too, has invested heavily in directed energy weapons. In 2019, reports surfaced that Chinese scientists had developed a handheld laser gun capable of igniting flammable materials from a distance. Although primarily intended for military use, the development of such technology shows that China is exploring a wide range of possibilities in the directed energy field. Chapter 7. The Diplomatic Fallout, an Unfinished Story. By 2020, Havana Syndrome was no longer an isolated incident. It had become a full-blown international crisis with hundreds of reported cases. What started with a handful of U.S. diplomats and CIA officers stationed in Cuba had spread to embassies in China, Europe, and even Washington, D.C. As more victims came forward, the focus shifted from understanding the syndrome's medical origins to grappling with its geopolitical implications. Was this a new type of covert weapon? Who was behind the attacks? And why was the U.S. government so hesitant to act? As pressure mounted for answers, the U.S. found itself in an increasingly delicate position on the global stage. Real-world diplomatic tensions between the U.S., Russia, and other nations accused of involvement began to escalate. Victims, many of whom were still suffering from debilitating symptoms, formed advocacy groups to push for accountability. urging the government to take a stand and demand answers from the international community. One such group, spearheaded by former CIA officer Mark Polymeropoulos, made waves in Washington. Polymeropoulos, who had been stationed in Moscow and believed he was a victim of a directed energy attack in 2017, was one of the loudest voices calling for action. In interviews and testimony before Congress, he detailed his experience and the lack of response from the government. "We were attacked, plain and simple," he said in one televised interview. "The fact that this is still being swept under the rug is an insult to those of us who served our country." Despite these public outcries, the U.S. government remained cautious. On one hand, officials could no longer deny that something serious was happening. Real accounts from victims, many of whom were intelligence officers, made it clear that the attacks were not random or coincidental. The evidence pointed to a deliberate campaign targeting U.S. diplomats and spies. Yet, despite this, the government stopped short of directly accusing any one nation of being responsible. Instead, they opted for a vague, non-committal stance, referring to the incidents as unexplained health problems and emphasizing that the cause remained unclear. Behind closed doors, however, it was a different story. Classified intelligence reports, leaked memos, and insider accounts from the intelligence community revealed that many officials believed Russia was behind the attacks. The theory was based on several factors: the sophistication of the attacks, the patterns of targeted individuals, and perhaps most damning, the fact that many of the victims had been involved in sensitive intelligence work related to Russian operations. Signals intelligence collected by the National Security Agency also hinted at Russian involvement, though the evidence was not definitive. Several intelligence officers familiar with the situation spoke anonymously to the press, revealing the internal debates raging within the U.S. government. One former officer stated, "There's little doubt in my mind that the Russians are behind this. They have the capability, the motive, and the history of using unconventional means to target their enemies. But proving it in a way that would justify public action is another matter entirely." The dilemma for the U.S. government was clear. Accusing Russia without concrete, indisputable proof could spark a diplomatic crisis, or worse, a military conflict. Russia, a nuclear-armed state, had shown in recent years that it was willing to push the boundaries of international norms, from the annexation of Crimea to interference in U.S. elections. But accusing them of deploying a new, invisible weapon against American diplomats was a different level of provocation. The risk of escalation, including retaliatory cyber attacks or military skirmishes, loomed large in the minds of U.S. policymakers. President Joe Biden's administration found itself in a particularly difficult position. While several top officials were pushing for a tougher stance on Russia, urging the administration to hold Moscow accountable for its actions, others were more cautious. As one White House aide put it, "The last thing we want is to provoke a confrontation with Russia, especially over something we can't definitively prove." The internal political calculus also played a role in shaping the U.S. response. Some lawmakers on Capitol Hill, particularly those on intelligence and foreign relations committees, were pushing for more aggressive action. They argued that the U.S. needed to send a clear message that such attacks would not be tolerated, regardless of the potential fallout. Others, however, cautioned restraint, fearing that an aggressive response could lead to a dangerous tit-for-tat cycle of retaliation. As a result, the U.S. government's official position remained frustratingly ambiguous. Diplomatic talks with Russia over the issue stalled, with both sides accusing each other of bad faith. Russia, for its part, denied any involvement in Havana Syndrome, dismissing the accusations as baseless and absurd. In one particularly pointed statement, a Russian foreign ministry official called the allegations a product of the fevered imagination of American intelligence agencies. Amidst this geopolitical stalemate, the victims of Havana Syndrome continued to suffer. Many of them felt abandoned by their government, left to fend for themselves as their health deteriorated. Several victims struggled with long-term symptoms such as cognitive impairment, memory loss, and chronic pain. Some were unable to return to work, while others faced significant medical bills with little assistance from the government. One former diplomat, who had been stationed in Havana during the initial wave of attacks, summed up the frustration felt by many victims. "We put our lives on the line for our country, And this is how we're repaid? With silence and inaction? It's a disgrace. In the absence of a clear resolution, uncertainty reigns. Will the U.S. ever hold those responsible accountable? Or will the attacks continue, unchecked, as the world turns a blind eye? The Havana Syndrome may not be a closed chapter in history, but rather the opening salvo in a new, invisible kind of warfare, one that targets the mind rather than the body and operates in the shadows, with few answers in sight.